Als nächstes möchte ich nun die Moderation an Dr. Jessica von Seggern übergeben. Frau von Seggern ist Abteilungsleiterin im Staatsarchiv Hamburg und war selbst auch schon viele Jahre als Referatsleiterin für die Benennung von Verkehrsflächen zuständig. Jessica von Seggern is Head of Department in the Hamburg State Archives. She has a long experience in working in the administration for the naming of streets in Hamburg and will now do the moderation of the first part now. Jessica, it's your turn.
Vielen Dank, thank you. Welcome to the first part of our two-day symposium on colonial street names. I'm very pleased that you're all with us for our conference. It shows a great interest in the very important discussion. Our focus on the one hand is dealing with colonial street names in Hamburg, but we want to put it in a larger context. With the first three lectures, which will soon start, we want to seek to provide an overview of different perspectives on German colonial history. For us, it's a great honor to have three declared experts who will introduce us to the topic. And I think we'll get by this way a very profound basis for our further discussion. First, I may welcome Professor Oswald Masebo. He's a senior lecturer in history at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania and also serves as the president of the Historical Association of Tanzania. He teaches and conducts research in colonial history, cultural heritage, and nation building in Tanzania. Professor Masebo will give an introduction to German colonial history with a focus on Tanzania. The title of his speech is Tanzanian Perspective on German Colonial History. Professor Masebo, welcome to our conference. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Let me start by, first of all, thanking the organizers of this symposium for inviting me to take part in this extremely important symposium on German colonialism more generally, but more so on dealing with the street names in Hamburg and in the German cities more generally. Now, let me start with some contextual remarks. I'm using the concept colonialism to mean a process in which one country goes to another country or place and it controls that country economically, politically, culturally, militarily, and in all other realms of human life. In essence, therefore, colonialism is about imposing one's country's rule and demands over another country and its people. And from this definitional situation, I would like to argue that colonialism is a process that embodies and it's infused with the power relations. It's a process in which one country or nation exercises power over another nation or group of people. In other words, colonialism is a process in which a colonizing society imposes and projects its economic, political, cultural, social, military, and even scientific power over the colonized society. So I thought I should provide that definitional statement before I proceed forward. This definition, which I have just provided, has to be understood in the context of the ideas and practices that Germany and other Western European nation states pursued starting from the last quarter of the 19th century in Africa. European nations such as Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium moved decisively from their home soils, invaded African societies, conquered them, and established colonial states and colonial relations in Africa. They built new economic institutions, new political systems, new cultural relations, as well as military and technological regimes that would leave lasting legacies to Africans, even after the end of formal colonialism in the second half of the 20th century. Now, I think it's important before we move forward to understand why Germany and other Western European nation states decided to have colonies in the late 19th century, particularly in the last quarter of the 19th century. And I want to mention that there have been contested arguments as to why Germany and other European nation states established colonies in Africa. And I would like to highlight some of these contestations. Now, on one hand, there are some commentators who have used psychological and diplomatic arguments to justify colonialism in Africa. And now, what are some of these psychological and diplomatic arguments which have been advanced by some commentators? Let me mention some of them. We have commentators who argue that the main agenda behind Western European nation states establishing colonies in Africa is that they wanted to spread Christianity. That was the main agenda. But we also have commentators who justify colonialism in the late 19th century as expression of nationalism, as expression of European nationalism, German nationalism, British nationalism, French nationalism. So colonialism being reduced into expression of colonialism. Thirdly, we have commentators who have pointed out that the main agenda behind establishing colonialism in Africa was actually to enhance the prestige of European nation states. That there was nothing else behind establishing colonial systems in Africa apart from the desire to uphold and enhance the prestige status of European nation states. Yet we have commentators who have also pointed out that, the reason for having colonies in Africa was for global strategic reasons. That, Western European nations were not interested in African spaces as such, but only that Africa was a strategic location, particularly strategic in relation to Asia, such as India or China, etc. And I want to add two more justifications which such commentators have used. We have commentators who have moved further and have used social Darwinistic arguments of survival of the fittest, making erroneous claims that, it was the right of superior race of European nations, such as the Germans, to colonize inferior races. And yet others have used atavistic arguments, social atavistic arguments developed by scholars such as Joseph Schumpeter, that colonialism was nothing but just a natural desire, natural phenomenon. And many of these arguments have also based on eugenic arguments and theories. And these are kind of arguments which it's easier to characterize as psychological and diplomatic. Now, the second category of comments which have been produced as to why European nation states established colonialism in Africa have paid attention to economic motivations, economic reasons. Now, and economic explanations which have been advanced in most cases are related to the development of capitalism, and development of capitalism, particularly from competitive capitalism towards monopoly capitalism. Transformations in capitalism, especially from the 1850s to around 1880s. Now, what was specific with this particular development? I think the notable development, especially from the second half of the 19th century, was the development of industrial revolutions in many European nation states. By the 1870s, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and other European nation states were undergoing industrial revolutions. Now, industrial revolutions had certain needs which could not be met in Western Europe alone. Western European nation states needed other processes to support industrial revolution. Now, Africa was conceived to be one of the solutions that could support industrial revolutions. Now, what were the economic motivations? I want to point out 5 economic motivations that motivated the Germans and the other Western European nation states to establish colonies in Africa. The first economic motivation I would like to point out is that colonies were expected to be sources of raw materials, which were needed by the growing industries in Europe. Growing industries needed substantial amount of agricultural raw materials, such as cotton, tea, coffee, etc. And Africa provided potentials of providing agricultural raw materials. But Africa also was seen to be having great potentials of mineral resources. And therefore, European nation states knew that they would exploit minerals that again were needed by the growing industries in Europe. So that's number one. But the second economic motivation for having colonies in Africa is that colonies were expected to be sources of cheap labor. Cheap labor would help European nation states and the business market to minimize costs of production and therefore to maximize profits. That was the second economic motivation. The third economic motivation is that colonies were expected to serve as spaces for external markets of industrial manufactured commodities. Number 4 is that colonies were considered to be potential areas for investing surplus capital, which was generated by the growing industrial economy in Western Europe. And then number 5 is that colonies were also places for depositing the surplus population of people who had no employment opportunities in Europe, and therefore people who posed some elements of security threats to the survival of European nation states. And in my opinion, in comparative terms, when I compare non-economic reasons versus economic reasons, I am convinced that economic explanations, which were linked to the growing needs of industrial revolutions, are more plausible and provide better justification for understanding the enormous drive which European nation states unleashed in Africa in the second half of the 19th century. Now, having realized the economic potentials which Africa offered, European nation states embarked, especially from the 1870s and early 1880s, into the process we call Scramble for and eventual partition of Africa, the process through which Germany acquired colonies in Africa. The point is, the economic drive for the colonies in Africa was quite intense. Thus, starting from the 1860s and 1870s, each European nation sponsored agents to explore the economic potentialities in Africa. European nation states, as well as private companies, sent missionaries, they sent traders, explorers, geographers, physical anthropologists, scientists, etc. And these agents of European colonial interests roamed in different parts of Africa, and they collected substantial amount of information, which they sent back to Western Europe. As European nation states received encouraging news about the economic potentials of Africa, they embarked on intense competition for acquiring lands in Africa. The British, the French, the Portuguese, the Germans, and the Belgians, for instance, all rushed to acquire colonies in Africa. And I want to mention that the competition among European nation states was so intense that it almost led to war among themselves. European nations, including the Germans, competed to control Africa. They competed to control the rich natural resources in Africa. They competed to control fertile soils for agriculture. They competed to control huge mineral deposits in Africa, to control the huge population which was growing in Africa, but also to tap the growing market potentials of the growing African population. I think it's important to understand this background information so that to see why there was this rush. Now, these competitions and scramble among European nations almost resulted into war. In fact, the war was averted when Chancellor von Bismarck convened a conference in Berlin. So once again, Berlin, by the mid-1880s, evolved to be a key actor in shaping colonial agenda in Africa. Now, the agenda of the conference in Berlin, the conference of 1884-1885, was on how European nation states could divide Africa among themselves peacefully. Now, Africa was divided among European nation states. What is surprising is that Africans were not part of this particular conference. European nation states drew and produced cartographic networks and maps. And it was through these divisions, peaceful divisions, that Germany eventually got some colonies in Africa. To be precise, Germany, for instance, got a colony in East Africa, which consisted of areas that today consist of Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda. These fell and became German colonies in East Africa. We also understand Germany also got a colony in Southwest Africa, which is present day known as Namibia. Germany also got shares of colonies in West Africa. Now, this is a background story that I think is extremely important to understand and to appreciate when we think about renaming streets in Hamburg, but also in other places in German cities. Now, after the Berlin conference, what followed now was a strategy to actually now acquire colonies in different parts of Africa. And it is through these processes that now German began to establish and to institutionalize colonies in East Africa, in Southwest Africa, but also in West Africa. What I want to do in the next part of my presentation is to point out quite briefly some of the processes that were involved in creating colonies in Africa, using Germany as a case study and using Tanzania as a case study. I'll be quite brief. But the first process, the first major process, is that the Germans embarked on what we would call the military conquest, the military conquest. I want to emphasize that establishing German colonialism in Tanzania, for instance, or in East Africa, was not an easy task. Tanzanians were not willing to accept German colonialism, and they did everything that was humanly possible to resist German colonialism. And so the Germans had to mobilize huge military armies to deal with African resistance. Brutal military confrontations ensued. And in fact, researchers have established that about 55 military confrontations were experienced in Tanzania in the span of about 6 years, from 1890. And I can assure you, a great deal of Tanzanians lost their lives as they fought for their own freedom, as they fought for their own autonomy, as they resisted German colonialism. Bloodshed, thefts, peace, and insecurities ensued. And therefore, in Tanzanian histories, the early years of German colonial conquest in the 1880s, in the early 1900s, were one of traumatic moments in which sufferings, famine, insecurity, fear ensued. And no one would like to go through that kind of experience anymore, as thousands of Tanzanians lost their lives. But the second process, which was also critical in shaping and creating the colonial network in Tanzania, included giving the landscape, both the physical landscape and cultural landscape, the new meaning and identity. And one of these processes involved renaming processes, renaming places in German names and in German languages. And therefore, urban places in Tanzania were changed. Rather than maintaining the local and native names, the Germans imposed new names, German places. And so an example, an area which was among the Nyakyusa, which is present day known as Tukuyu in southwest Tanzania. It was now named as Langenbach rather than as Tukuyu. And so many urban places everywhere in Tanzania were being given German names. The idea and the logic behind was to give this East African landscape German identity, but also to infuse the German culture. The third process, which was associated with the creation and consolidation of German colonialism in Tanzania, had to do with what we would call cultural and natural violence. I want to underline that a great deal of our valued cultural heritage, as well as natural heritage, was plundered by the German agents during this particular period. In the 1880s, in the 1890s, in the 1900s, up to the outbreak of the First World War, a great deal of our cultural heritage, of our cultural values was plundered and looted in Tanzania and taken all the way, transported to Germany. And this is the heritage, the cultural artifacts, which are presently housed in many of the museums in Germany and in other parts of Western Europe. These are the cultural artifacts housed in many private institutions, public institutions, in many parts of Germany and beyond Germany. But there were also a plundering of natural heritage, natural resources, animals, plants, insects, you name each and everything. So many of these materials, both cultural and natural, which are hosted in certain parameters in Europe, were actually acquired during German colonial period. And therefore, when you make an imagination of German colonialism, it's important to assign the conscious efforts to plunder cultural and natural resources that were in Tanzania. And I can assure you a great deal of these resources, some of them cannot be found in Tanzania anymore. They can easily be found in Germany. And so the young generation in Tanzania and in many African societies actually can no longer have access to the valued cultural resources and repertoires which our ancestors produced. That's number two. The other thing was actually purposeful killing of Africans for human body parts, and even collecting human body parts of people who had died. This was done especially during military confrontations. And I want to underline that this is one of the most atrocious acts that were committed during the German colonial experience in Tanzania. Body parts of our ancestors were collected. Some of our ancestors who were engaged in wars of resistances against invading armies were captured and beheaded. And several of their body parts, their scars, their fingers, their skin, their tissues were taken to Europe, taken to Germany, and any other places you may wish to mention. And for what purposes? For scientific researches, for medical scientific researches, for physical anthropological researches. And what's the implication of all this? The implication I want to underline is that colonialism was a complex venture. And one of them was scientific studies and researches. And all of a sudden, Africa was transformed into specimen for research, not only medical researches, biological researches, but also physical anthropological studies to understand the anatomy and the human genetics. And so I think one of the central violences which German colonialism committed to Tanzanians, and I think it was the colonial experience everywhere, was this inhuman treatment of dead bodies, and sometimes killing people purposefully in context of military confrontations, collecting the human body parts and taking them for scientific studies in medical schools, in research institutes, in museums, sometimes for fun, but in the name of science. But the other point which I would like to mention is this one, that the establishment of colonialism also involved building new economic, political, and cultural institutions. Some of them existed even in pre-colonial period, but some of them were new. Some of the economic institutions, for instance, which the Germans created in Tanzania, included agricultural plantations, such as the sisal plantations, tea plantations, coffee plantations, which were unprecedented. These were economic undertakings, which were meant to provide needed cash crops as raw materials for the growing industries in Germany, but also in other parts of Europe. They also established and created new political institutions and state institutions, the prisons, the colonial army, the police force. And these were institutions of social control, the institutions for ensuring peace and security in the colonies, but more importantly, for policing the Tanzanians and repositioning them in processes where colonial authorities thought they should be in order to uphold the ideals of colonialism, which they wanted to enmesh and establish in this particular stuff. The Germans also, during these early periods, established cultural institutions such as Christianity, cultural institutions such as formal education, cultural institutions such as racialized social modalities, racism and racialism, arranging urban spaces according to color, and institutionalizing the level of racism that divided the people along racial lines and color. And I want to point out that the creation of these cultural institutions, religious institutions, social institutions, educational institutions, was not accidental. These played a critical ideological role of, making Tanzanians, men and women, youth and children, accept the colonial network. That would, in essence, create the platform for Germany to realize the economic potentials they had envisaged. So the creation of these ideological institutions and the other parameters of colonial networks were only secondary of interest, but they were expected to serve the larger economic agenda that were to ensure within this particular frameworks. But I want to underline that even after the initial resistances against German colonialism surfaced, and almost after 15 years of colonialism, Tanzanians aggressively resisted colonialism. And I think one of the major landmarks that may give you a sense of the urgency of Tanzanians resisting colonialism was the so-called Maji Maji Wars, the war through which Tanzanians in large sectors of southern Tanzania mobilized themselves within their own local chiefs and mounted unprecedented military confrontations against the German invaders. And these were wars that were fought for 2 consecutive years, from 1905 to 1907. Over 14 ethnic groups were part of these mobilized Tanzanian communities, waging with a lot of courage, regardless of the kind of weapons they had, but with the hearts, with the power, and with the visions to protect their identity, to protect their sanctity, their autonomy, and their creed. So they did everything that was humanly possible within the limits imposed by colonial networks. It wasn't to be, but it was a great wrestle for Germans that they had to modify the patterns and thrusts that they were dealing with the Tanzanians during this particular period. And within the remaining 7 years of German colonialism, from 1907 up to 1914, when the First World War broke, and which literally led to the end of German colonialism in Tanzania, there were major changes in the way Germany were dealing and perceiving Tanzanians during this particular time. I want to underline the final note in this presentation. And this is the idea that the whole agenda of Germany to establish colonialism in Tanzania was transformative, to transform Tanzanian people, the geography, both the physical and cultural landscape, into German, so that Tanzania could serve the interests of German colonialism. In fact, the idea of the Germans was fundamentally, literally speaking, to destroy the Tanzanian culture. The most important thing I want to underline before I conclude my lecture is that Tanzanians, despite all the difficult conditions they experienced, were extremely resilient. Tanzanians were very resilient. It doesn't matter how powerful the Germans projected to Tanzanians, different communities in the different parts of Tanzania, or in Burundi, or in Rwanda. I want to underline the resilience of Tanzania in coping with the difficult conditions which German colonialism had created. Doesn't matter how it went through, but they were resilient. The resistances which they worked during German colonial conquest were elements of resilience which they pursued. Even after resistance wars were crushed by the 1900s, even as the Germans created all the necessary strategies to manipulate the directions of Tanzanians, the Tanzanians communities remained resilient. Even as the German agents created Christianity and spread cross Christianity, promoted Western education, promoted Western culture, reorganized social and physical spaces, the resilience of Tanzanians remained. They held dear to what defined them as Tanzanians. Even after the crash of the Maji Wars, Tanzanians remained resilient. The efforts of the Germans to manipulate, to act hegemonically on Tanzanians proved failure. So it doesn't matter, no matter how destructive from the economic, political, military, and even technological point of view, no matter how disruptive German colonialism developed, but the inner essence of Tanzanian communities remained. The inner essence and power of Tanzanian households remained. And I want to argue that it was probably this element of resilience that even forced Germans to modify over time as they engaged with the Tanzanians. It wasn't an easy task. No matter how dear we can reflect on this particular matter, the innermost value and sense of what it meant to be a Tanzanian, of what it meant, for instance, to be a Ndari, to be a Nyakyusa, to be a Bena, to be a Chaga, to be a Haya, what it meant to be a Maasai, what it meant to be a Ngoni. I want to underline that essence was never lost, no matter how difficult and challenging moments Tanzanian lived. So I want to underline that particular stuff. And in fact, I should maybe as a matter of concluding, I should take this moment to thank the organizers for inviting me to take part in this conversation. But I want to underline as a matter of legacy, and how Tanzanians remember colonialism, particularly German colonialism, the memory dimension. And I want to argue that although German colonialism ended in Tanzania officially during the First World War, that by 1918, no more German colonialism in Tanzania. But German colonialism has continued to exist and to be present in Tanzania, even as we speak. There has been enormous efforts to erase memories of German colonialism. Unfortunately, German colonialism continued to be a living symbol in Tanzania. When the British took over the colonization of Tanzania after the end of German colonialism, the major mission of the British was actually to erase German colonialism. The problem is it was impossible, partly because the Germans had established institutions which could not be dismantled. So despite all the effort of the British to erase the memories, sometimes even to portray the kind of images they wanted for, and to create their own legitimacy, it didn't work. After the end of British colonialism, starting from the 1960s, when Tanzania got independence, what Tanzania did was not really to decolonize colonialism, the German colonialism. I guess that what Tanzania have been doing from the 1960s to the present have rather been to nationalize the German colonial project, to nationalize it so that it served the nation building agenda. So the railways which were constructed, the economic setups which were constructed during the German colonialism, what Tanzania did was to nationalize it, transform its architecture so that it could be set within the nation building agenda, making it such a politically charged undertaking that would eventually serve the nation building project. That probably should bring me to the end of this particular contextual lecture by making this statement. German colonialism was such a violent undertaking, such an unfortunate experience in Tanzania. But no matter how violent it was, I feel proud when I look at the resilience. I feel proud when I look at the resilience of Tanzanians, particularly on how they handled the German colonial project, how they coped with the difficult conditions created by that project, and how they survived through it, how they ensured their inner values, their fundamentals and beliefs remained intact. Thank you for your attention.
Jetzt müsste auch mein Video wieder starten.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your
Okay.
very impressive and very wide context you gave us for our conference. I think we've got a very deep idea of what happened during the years of colonialism and the impact colonialism has on the Tanzanian society, on the Tanzanian culture. So I was really impressed. It gave you mentioned lots of milestones of colonial history, and I think you showed as well the different agendas of the colonial powers which motivated them to do what they did, and that it wasn't, even if it seemed to have a positive aim, it wasn't at the same time destroying another culture. So I'm very interested in the questions from the audience. I'll have a look at it. There are lots of questions, so I must see where it starts. The first question, which came from the audience, is: to which extent would you say that the German colonialism shaped the Tanzanian identity as a nation and people in comparison to Ujama politics? Sorry, I don't know the word.
Can you repeat the question?
The first question is: to which extent would you say that the German colonialism shaped the Tanzanian identity as a nation and people in comparison to Ujama politics?
Thank you for this very interesting question. The extent to which German colonialism shaped Tanzania's identity compared to the way Ujama shaped the identity of our nation. I think the starting point to understand Tanzanian identity is to look at it as a product of cultural exchange. That's what I think I would strongly argue, that the identity of Tanzania we see today and what it means to be a Tanzanian is a product of cultural exchange. And this cultural exchange is deeply embedded within the transformations that Tanzanian societies have experienced. The present identity of Tanzania is a product of the following forces, I would suggest. First, the present identity of Tanzania embodies pre-colonial Tanzanian heritages. And here I'm speaking of pre-colonial Tanzanian values, traditions, culture, knowledge systems, and identities. Each Tanzanian ethnic group had its own unique identity, but there were also overlapping values across these identities. These identities are still evident in what we call Tanzanian identity today. But another important milestone in the transformation of Tanzanian societies was the interaction between Tanzanian communities and the external world, particularly interactions with the Middle East and Far East, as well as the traumatic experience of slave trade. Now that went hand in hand with creation of elements of Islamic culture, Arabic culture, and the interplay of what we call the Swahili culture. Now, that Swahili culture has also been a part and parcel of the identity of Tanzania. And later on, a very major transformation of these Tanzanian societies was the colonial experience. And here I refer to both the British and the German colonial experience. These left marks in the making of Tanzania. And so post-colonial Tanzania have also some elements, inherited elements of colonial networks. After independence, Tanzania embarked on a robust movement of Ujamaa, which is socialism in Tanzania. And it also contributed to mold what we call Tanzania. So, to conclude, to understand the identity of Tanzania, you have to go back into the history of the making of Tanzania. And that history is deeply embedded within such a long experience of transformation from the pre-colonial period, actually from ancient period to the present. So the identity of Tanzania is not a product of one major force. Ujamaa played a key role, but it's not the only role that have shaped the identity of Tanzanians. What is Tanzania must be understood within the cultural repertoires of all the ethnic communities in Tanzania, including the shared complex cultural exchanges that Tanzanians have experienced through the making of the nation state. So that's what I would like to identify, to point out. It's not proper to weigh the influence of German colonial legacy or Ujamaa legacy, but to look at the national identity as something that has been produced historically and can only be understood historically. Out of the historical context, there is no identity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your answer. I've got some more questions. The next one is, what do you think Germany could learn from Tanzania when it comes to memory culture of the colonial past?
I think there is something that Germany can learn from Tanzania. And there is also something that Germany can learn from its own history, particularly in dealing with memory culture, in dealing with colonial culture. Number one, I think that Germany can learn, first of all, from its own difficult past. The thing I see when I look at how Germany is trying to deal with the difficult colonial past, sometimes, especially when I think of how Germany is trying to deal with the German colonial past in Africa, sometimes I don't think Germany is honest enough in confronting the difficult past. Why am I saying that? I think Germany did extremely well in confronting the difficult Holocaust, the difficult Nazi past. Germany did extremely well in dealing with the memory culture, which actually resulted from the extreme Nazi politics. And the way the Germans have handled that difficult past, the way they have reconciled and accepted that past, has helped the Germans to heal that difficult past and to bring an element of reconciliation. That's what I see. The Tanzanians have handled the colonial past, I would say, extremely well. Tanzanians accepted that Tanzanians accepted that German colonialism was real. It was a lived experience. Tanzanian men, women, Tanzanian youth and children went through the horrible experience of German colonialism. Tanzanians have not and have never shied away from that process. And Tanzanians created the institutional frameworks in their educational curriculums, in their social frameworks, and even in the economic programs to nationalize the difficult colonial past and to transform this difficult colonial past into a national building agenda. This is something the Germans can learn from Tanzanians, to accept the difficult colonial heritage which they have. And what I see today is that we see a lot of social movements from among certain German circles to deal with the difficult colonial past. But you may correct me, I know a great deal of Germans who are not willing to take responsibility of the wrongs brought by German colonialism. Racial politics, racist politics, homophobic politics continue to be manifested among certain German circles. And I wanted to underline, just as the Germans were able to handle very productively the Nazi difficult past, maybe they can learn from Tanzanians on how best to deal with the difficult past. And I can assure you, Tanzanians are humble people. Tanzanians are honest people. But I can assure you, within that humbleness, Tanzanians are also very tough guys. And I think it's this toughness which I emphasize as an element of resilience, the capability to deal with the difficulties and to navigate through them. That's something the Germans can learn from Tanzanians. And Tanzanians are more than happy, I think, in my opinion, to engage with the Germans, particularly in dealing with this difficult past. One thing I would like to underline before I finish a response on this question, there is no way you can feel happy and assume everything is okay if you cannot acknowledge the wrongs of the past. German cannot project her position in the world if, in the first instance, cannot deal productively with this difficult past. Tanzanians have managed, I think, quite well. And I think it's within this framework that when we handle these matters honestly and humbly, I think we're gonna move into new levels of handling these matters. So that's what I thought I should respond in terms of what German can learn from Tanzania. I think there is a great deal. And the more Germany learn from Tanzania, particularly how we have handled these matters, I think the more collegiate, even the diplomatic processes would be very amicable and friendly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should write this to our agenda. I look for the next question. The next question concerns the Maji-Maji uprising. It is, who are the main perpetrators of the repression against the Maji-Maji uprising? How is the Maji-Maji war remembered in Tanzania today?
This is another, I think, very, very good question. How is Maji-Maji remembered in Tanzania? And I wanted to mention two things before I point out how is Maji-Maji remembered. There has been a lot of misinterpretation and a misconstruction about Maji-Maji, starting from the German colonial period. And in fact, the first guys who misconstructed and provided wrong interpretations about the Maji-Maji were the Germans. They portrayed Maji-Maji as atavistic. And they portrayed the Tanzanians who fought in Maji-Maji as warmongers, as bloodthirsty. And they did something very terrible in characterizing Maji-Maji. And this is also evident in the question. The question is looking at Maji-Maji as a rebellion. And I wanted to point out very clear, it's wrong. It's wrong to look at Maji-Maji as a rebellion. Maji-Maji, fundamentally speaking, was not a rebellion, because a rebellion is when someone rebels against a legitimate authority, a legitimate state. And so long as German colonialism and German colonial state was not legitimate in Tanzania, it was established by sheer force. I have mentioned over 55 military confrontations which Tanzanians waged. Okay, their defeat is the one which first enabled the Germans to establish the colonial state. So in the first place, the German colonial state was not a legitimate authority. So it's wrong to characterize Maji-Maji as a rebellion. It wasn't a rebellion. It was a war of resistance against German colonialism. Now the question is, how is Maji-Maji was remembered? I want to underline that Maji-Maji, which took place over 100 years ago, remain a lived experience as we speak of now. Tanzanians have never forgotten the Maji-Maji War. What is surprisingly, even during the British colonial period, before independence, the British used the Maji-Maji wars to discredit the Germans. So one of the grand stories during the British colonial period was to use Maji-Maji to create their own legitimacy and acceptable. So the British did extremely well to discredit the German colonial rule. And when we got independence in 1961, Tanzania made conscious efforts to depict Maji-Maji as one of the heroic and romantic stories in the making of Tanzania. So the first history curriculum in the 1960s had beautiful stories about the heroes who fought in Maji-Maji wars under the influence of King Jekitile. And since then, every children in primary school, every children in secondary schools, and every youth who studies history in the universities learn about Maji-Maji. And let me tell you this, recently, there are public commemorations of Maji-Maji, especially in areas of Songea, in Ruvuma, among the Ngoni. But there are also commemorations of Maji-Maji in all areas where Maji-Maji were fought. Why is this important? This is important because the Maji-Maji War is not simply a historical phenomenon. It is part and parcel of the fabric of the making of Tanzania. It's one of the inspiring stories that connote the struggles of Tanzanians in the making of their own dear true self and in fashioning space in the context of difficult scenarios. So the memories of Tanzanians over Maji Maji are very live. It took place over 100 years ago, but it continues to be part and parcel of our lived experiences, and we continue to commemorate it even today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have got some more questions and we are already far in time. So I would like to ask you to give a short answer to the next questions, even if I think they are very interesting and very important. The next question is, what is the specificity of German colonialism in Tanzania compared to other colonial powers like Britain, for example?
Can you repeat the question, please?
What is the specificity of German colonialism in Tanzania compared to other colonial powers like Britain?
I think that when you compare German colonialism and British colonialism, in my opinion, German colonialism compared to British colonialism was short-lived. It was formally operative from around 1890 to 1914. That's roughly about 24, 23 years. But British colonialism was almost 40 years, almost 40 years. But the legacy of German colonialism, in my opinion, far outweigh British colonialism. And even the physical manifestations of German colonialism far outweighs British colonialism. For example, most of the major physical infrastructures like the railways, which we see in Tanzania today, were built during the German colonial period. Most of the tourist attraction sites in many of the cities in Tanzania are those which were created during the German colonial period, including the buildings, the houses, even the organization of the space. The urban organization of states were products of the German colonial period. And I think the British utilized colonial infrastructures that were created by the German colonial period. I think if there is anything that far outweigh the German colonial period was probably the German language. I think the only thing which the British did extremely well was to erase the German language in Tanzania and to replace it with English. But in my opinion, the economic base, the state base, the political organization, and even the cultural parameters, I think the influence and the legacy of the German colonial period were far deeply embedded in our society than the British colonial period. That's what I would like to respond on that.
Thank you very much. I see with some more questions, but the time is just over and I just got the information that the next lecturer is already there. So I would like to know from my colleagues, what shall we do? Shall we ask the further questions? There are some more, or shall we start with the next lecture?
Perhaps one or two more questions and then the next.
Okay, so we are allowed to have one or two more questions. So I would ask you to give a very short answer so that we don't have a long delay. So the next question is, have all German names been removed from cities, streets, mountain tops, etc. in Tanzania now?
Actually, most of the names were removed. Most of the names were removed actually during the British colonial period. Most of the names were removed during the German colonial period. And if there are those which remains, probably very few, I can't mention, but I think there were two phases in trying to decolonize colonial culture. The first one was immediately after the end of the German colonial period, when the British took over from the Germans. They tried to get rid of German influence. So in many parts, they tried to repress German names with British names. That was the first phase. But the second phase was after the independence of Tanzania, when the newly independent nation made effort to actually get rid of most of the remaining German names, but also the British names, and to come up with the nationalist-oriented street names. So where there were names depicting maybe colonial authorities, now we had names representing leaders of liberation struggles in Africa. So, but you know, renaming the street names, renaming this particular is not complete. I think it's an ongoing agenda that needed to be ensured.
Thank you very much.
Question?
Thank you very much. So one last question is, wait a moment, now I lost my, since this conference is about the question of colonial street names, what should German cities do with the colonial street names today? What's your opinion on this?
Well, maybe two opinions. Number one, I think the German cities should move an extra mile and honestly acknowledge the colonial relations, and they realize that there were efforts. You know, today the Germans are making efforts to decolonize street names. The Germans should realize there were Tanzanians who made the efforts to decolonize and to end colonialism. Maybe, and this is the first suggestion, the Germans, in renaming the streets, should also take into account the historicity of Tanzania and embody it in those street names. That's number one. Number two, which is even more important, I think what Germany needs now is to invest in changing the mindset of the young generation in Germany. I think that's the most intervention which German cities can do to rethink about the curriculum they teach to children, so that they bring in the perspective that the German children and the youth can come to terms with colonial history, can come to terms with Africa. Sometimes I think there is a lot of misunderstanding, misconstruction, misinformation, and disinformation about Africa. There must be conscious efforts by German authorities from the federal steps to state levels, to local authorities, to deal with the mindset, how to build a positive attitude and outlook, how to go beyond the narrow Eurocentric and Germanic perspective of the world systems. And I think, investing in children in Germany, investing in the youth, and giving them an alternative understanding that depicts the historical realities of the relationship between Germany and Africa, of Europe and Africa, would be such an important intervention. So one, renaming streets should be a process to confront the German past honestly, from deeply within their limbs. But secondly, investing in children and the youth. It may be too late to deal with the elders, but shaping the future generation of the German population would play a key role in transforming relations and creating the world which is a better place to live than probably it has been in the past few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the insight you gave us to the German colonialism in Tanzania and the sides we still can see in the actual situation, and for your readiness to answer the questions. I'm very sorry that we couldn't give answers to all the questions, but now I would like to turn to our next lecture. Thank you very much, Professor Masebo.